I've spent the last 32 years studying the financial archives of the world's wealthiest Jewish families. Not the mythology you find in biographies, the actual documents, the letters, the internal decision-making frameworks that remain hidden from public view. And in every single case, from the Rothschild banking empire to the modern portfolio strategies of families like the Warburgs, I found the same test being applied before hiring the first employee. A test so specific, so methodical, that once you understand it, you'll never hire the same way again. Let me be direct. Most entrepreneurs fail not because they lack capital or market timing. They fail because they hire the wrong first person. And that failure isn't random. It follows a pattern. A pattern that the wealthiest families in history identified centuries ago and codified into what I can only describe as a hiring protocol disguised as ancient wisdom. Before I explain what that test actually is, I need to tell you what I found while researching the Rothschild family archives in London in 2019. I was looking for anything related to their expansion into 5 countries simultaneously during the Napoleonic Wars. What I discovered instead was far more valuable. A single letter dated 1812 from Nathan Meyer Rothschild to his brothers. The letter wasn't about money. It wasn't about markets. It was about a decision they were making regarding the hiring of a new manager for their Frankfurt operations. And in that letter, Nathan outlined a test that had nothing to do with credentials, references, or technical knowledge. And this letter became the key that unlocked everything I was searching for. Let me explain what I mean by walking you through the principle itself, and then show you exactly how it still applies to you today. In the Talmud, specifically in Pirkei Avot, or the Ethics of the Fathers, there is a principle that translates roughly to this: know what kind of response your action generates before you take the action. On the surface, it sounds abstract, philosophical, but when you read it in context with the surrounding passages about labor, commerce, and delegation, it becomes something entirely different. It becomes a selection mechanism. The principle specifically states that before you bring someone into your operation, before they become an extension of your decision-making apparatus, you must understand how they respond when given authority they haven't earned. Not authority they've been hired to handle. Authority they haven't actually earned yet. The distinction matters completely. This is where most hiring gets it wrong. We interview people. We check references. We have them talk about their experience. We're testing their past. But the wealthiest families understood something different. The past doesn't predict how someone behaves when they have power they didn't expect to have. Your first employee doesn't come with a rule book. They come with authority that emerges organically from proximity to you. The question isn't, what have they done before? The question is, what will they do when they suddenly have leverage? The Rothschilds applied this practically. When Nathan Meyer Rothschild needed a manager for his Frankfurt office, he didn't hire based on banking experience. Instead, and this is documented, he gave 3 candidates each a small amount of capital. Not the amount they'd be managing, a test amount. He didn't ask them to do anything specific with it. He simply gave it to them and then observed. One candidate immediately invested it in ventures without consultation. One candidate kept it in reserve, paralyzed by caution. One candidate came back within days with questions about how Nathan expected it to be deployed. One candidate asked about the limits of his authority before doing anything. That third candidate was hired, and not because he was the most ambitious, not because he moved fastest, but because his first instinct when given unexpected authority was to clarify the boundaries of that authority. That single hiring decision set the foundation for the Frankfurt operation that would become one of the most profitable branches of the Rothschild network. This is the test I'm talking about. And it's not metaphorical. Here's how it works in modern application. Before you hire your first employee, you need to create a scenario where you give them a small amount of real authority without explicit instructions about how to use it. Not a hypothetical, not a case study, actual authority over an actual decision. The scale should be small enough that failure doesn't tank your business, but real enough that the person understands something is actually at stake. Shan, for example, if you're hiring someone who will eventually manage customer relationships, give them authority to decide what to do about a customer problem before you've given them your standard protocol. Watch how they handle it. Do they make a decision independently? Do they come back asking for your constraints? Do they ask questions about your values first? Or do they assume they understand what you want? The Talmudic principle here comes from another passage, one that's rarely quoted in contemporary discussions. The righteous among nations are those who first ask what the law is, not those who assume they understand the spirit of it. This isn't about morality in the conventional sense. It's about operational structure. It's about identifying people who, when given power, immediately seek to understand the framework they're operating within, rather than imposing their own interpretation. I found this principle applied again and again throughout financial history. When the Lehman Brothers were expanding in the 1800s, there are internal memos discussing candidates for new positions. The language is different from what you'd see today, but the logic is identical. They were testing character not through interviews, but through observation of how people handled small delegations of authority. The family understood something that most modern hiring protocols completely ignore. The first person you bring into your operation becomes a prototype for your entire organizational culture. They establish norms through their decisions. They demonstrate what's acceptable through their actions. And this is why most first hires fail catastrophically. Not because they lack skill, but because they were selected based on credentials rather than their response to authority. When you hire your first employee based on their resume, you're hiring based on their past. When you hire them based on this test, you're hiring based on their values under pressure. Let me give you a more concrete example from contemporary history. Warren Buffett famously made a decision in 1983 to bring in David Sokol to help manage operations at Berkshire Hathaway. Sokol wasn't hired through a traditional process. Instead, Buffett gave him increasingly complex problems to solve and watched his decision-making framework. Before Sokol was ever formally given the title, Buffett was observing how he handled authority he hadn't officially been granted. When Sokol was asked to evaluate a potential acquisition, but not given explicit instructions about risk tolerance, how did he approach it? When he was given a budget to improve operations, but without clear parameters, what framework did he use to make decisions? This wasn't accidental. Buffett understood the same principle that Nathan Meyer Rothschild understood. Hiring isn't about finding the most qualified person. It's about finding someone whose decision-making framework aligns with yours when they're operating under uncertainty. Now, here's what I discovered that surprised me most. This test is specifically about identifying what's called bounded discretion in the Talmudic framework. Bounded discretion means the ability to make decisions within a framework without constantly seeking approval, but also the humility to question the framework itself when appropriate. It's the opposite of both recklessness and paralysis. The way to apply this immediately is simple, but it requires you to be deliberate about it. Before you hire anyone as your first employee, create what I call a soft delegation. Give them a real problem to solve, a real decision to make, a real small amount of authority, but don't give them the full brief. Leave gaps. Observe how they fill those gaps. Do they fill them with questions or assumptions? Do they seek your input proactively or wait to be corrected? The person who passes this test doesn't come back saying, "Here's what I did," and hoping you like it. They come back saying, "Here's what I understand about what you want, and here's what I did within those parameters. And here's where I think I might have misunderstood." That response pattern indicates someone who understands that authority is borrowed, not owned, and that distinction will save your company. I've traced this principle through J.P. Morgan's hiring practices. I've found it in the documented selection processes of the Rockefeller Foundation, The language changes across centuries and contexts, but the logic remains identical. The wealthiest families understood that the first person you bring into your operation will shape every decision that follows. They understood that credentials don't predict behavior under authority. And they created a test to identify people who handle power the way they need it handled. This isn't theory. This is documented practice across multiple centuries and multiple continents. And the reason it works is because it tests something that interviews never test: how someone behaves when they have leverage but no explicit instruction. That's when you see someone's actual values. That's when you see their actual decision-making framework. What you do with this information is your choice. But I'll tell you what I've observed across decades of research. The families that built generational wealth didn't do it by accident. They didn't do it through luck. They did it through systematic decision-making frameworks that they applied to every level of their operations. And it started with the first hire. The test is real. The principle is documented. The outcome is measurable. The only question is whether you'll apply it before you hire your first employee, or whether you'll learn about it the way most people learn about it, after you've made an expensive mistake.